The first thing he noticed was the way she rode into town like she had nowhere to be and every reason to stay. The sun melting behind her in a blaze of copper and red, dust rising soft beneath her horse's hooves like a whispered secret, and the wind tugging at the brim of her hat as if trying to see her face. Caleb Turner leaned back in his chair outside the mercantile, boots crossed on the rail, hat tipped low, telling himself she was just another traveler chasing the horizon. And in Red Willow, strangers came and went, like tumbleweeds, blown in by trouble or boredom and blown out by morning. But something about her made the air sit heavy in his lungs. She dismounted slow, tying her mare to the hitching post with steady hands, not the nervous kind, not the hurried kind, but the kind that belonged to someone who knew how to wait. Her coat was long and dusty, her gloves worn but cared for, and when she pushed back her hat, Caleb caught a glimpse of sharp eyes, the color of storm clouds rolling over prairie grass. She looked up at the town sign like she was measuring it against a memory, and Caleb felt an odd twist in his chest, the kind that comes before a thunderstorm breaks. Red Willow had a way of swallowing stories whole. The saloon doors creaked, the blacksmith's hammer rang, and old men sitting on barrels watched her with open curiosity. Yet she walked past them like she was walking through ghosts. Caleb stood when she reached the hotel porch, not out of manners but out of instinct. She paused just a breath, her gaze brushing over him, not lingering, not inviting, just noticing. And in that single glance he felt seen in a way he had not felt since his father was laid beneath the cedar tree on Turner land. She stepped inside the hotel without a word, and Caleb told himself to sit back down, told himself it was none of his concern, but his boots found the dirt instead, carrying him across the street before his pride could catch up. He lingered near the open window, where voices drifted out. She asked for a room for 2 nights, maybe 3, her voice low and even, like a song you almost remember, and the clerk, nervous as a rabbit, handed her the key without asking too many questions. Caleb had grown up believing Red Willow remembered everything. The land remembered blood spilled on it, the river remembered who crossed it in spring flood, and the old Turner house at the edge of town remembered laughter, arguments, and prayers spoken over worn leather pages of a family Bible older than the war itself. That Bible had sat on the mantel since his grandfather's time, thick with dust and memory, names written in careful script marking births and deaths like quiet milestones. Caleb had not opened it since the night his father passed. He had no reason to look back when all he ever did was look forward that evening. As lanterns flickered to life and piano notes floated from the saloon, Caleb found himself standing beneath the hotel balcony, staring up at the thin strip of light beneath her door. He did not know her name, did not know her story, yet something tugged at him like a half-heard call across open land. He told himself she would ride out by sunrise, that strangers rarely stayed long in a town built on stubborn roots and old grudges. But he felt in his bones that this one carried more than a saddlebag and secrets. The next morning dawned pale and cool. Caleb saddled his horse meaning to ride fence lines, yet instead he found his path bending toward the hotel porch. She was already there, sipping coffee, eyes scanning the street like she was searching for a landmark only she could see. When he tipped his hat and offered a polite morning, she studied him in silence before replying, her voice calm but edged with something heavier than travel weariness. She asked how long his family had lived in Red Willow, and the question struck him harder than any accusation. He answered slow, 3 generations, maybe 4 if you counted the stories told around winter fires. She nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion. Then she said she was looking for the Turner place, said it like it was just another ranch on the map. But Caleb felt the ground shift under his boots. The Turner place was his place, had been his father's and his father's before him. He tried to read her expression and found only resolve. And as she stood to leave, brushing dust from her coat, she thanked him with a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. Caleb watched her walk down the street toward the road leading out to his land, and for the first time in years, he felt like the past was riding straight toward him instead of fading behind. Caleb reached the Turner place before she did, riding hard enough to leave the wind chasing his heels. The ranch house stood where it always had, white paint weathered to the color of bone, porch sagging just enough to show its age, cedar tree casting long fingers of shade across the yard. He dismounted and stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet that only old land can hold. Then he heard her horse approaching at an easy pace, not rushed, not uncertain. She rode through the open gate like she had crossed it before in another lifetime. She slid from the saddle and took in the house with steady eyes. No surprise, no hesitation, just recognition. Caleb felt a chill despite the rising sun. He asked her plain what business she had here, and she answered just as plain. Said she had come to see something that belonged to her mother once. Her words were careful, measured like steps across thin ice. Caleb crossed his arms and told her this land belonged to the Turners, had for near a century. She met his stare without flinching and replied that names written in ink sometimes tell a different story than fences and deeds. The wind picked up then, stirring dust along the porch boards as Caleb led her inside. The house smelled of cedar and thyme. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, catching on framed photographs and worn furniture. She moved slowly through the front room, fingers brushing the back of a chair, the edge of the mantel, like she was tracing a map only she could see. Caleb watched her closely, half expecting her to falter, to reveal herself as just another drifter chasing rumor. But there was nothing uncertain in the way she stepped toward the hearth. Her gaze settled on the old family Bible, resting where it always had. Thick leather, cracked with age, brass clasp dulled but unbroken. Caleb felt his breath hitched without knowing why. She reached for it but stopped short, turning to him as if asking silent permission. He gave a stiff nod he did not fully understand. She lifted the book carefully, like it carried more than paper and ink, and set it on the table beneath the window where morning light could fall across its pages. Caleb had not opened that Bible in years, not since the night grief pressed too heavy against his ribs. But she opened it without trembling, fingers steady as she turned past the Old Testament, past the faded ribbon marking Psalms, until she reached the pages at the back where the Turner names were written in careful black script. Births on one side, deaths on the other, a quiet ledger of existence. She traced the lines slowly, lips moving without sound, and Caleb found himself leaning closer, despite the tightness in his chest. There it was, written between his father's name and the space left blank for future generations. A name he had never truly noticed, or maybe had chosen not to see. Abigail Rose Turner, born in the spring of 1868. Beside it, a note written smaller, almost hidden, given to the Ashford family for protection. Caleb stared at the ink like it might rearrange itself into something less dangerous. He whispered that it meant nothing. That many children had been sent away in hard times, but his voice lacked conviction. She closed her eyes for a brief second before speaking. Said Abigail was her grandmother. Said the Ashfords had kept her safe after a land dispute turned violent. Said the Turners had believed enemies would come looking for blood, so the child was hidden under another name. Caleb shook his head as if that might clear it. His father had never spoken of such things, never mentioned a sister to his own father, never told stories of lost daughters or broken promises. Yet the ink did not lie. It sat there bold and unashamed. Beneath the morning light, silence filled the room, thick as smoke. Outside, a hawk cried over open fields, and Caleb felt the weight of generations pressing against his shoulders. She looked at him then, not as a stranger but as something closer. Not quite kin, not yet friend, but bound by lines written long before either of them took their first breath. She said she had not come to claim land or stir trouble, only to see where her blood began, only to stand once in the place her grandmother had been forced to leave. Caleb swallowed hard, staring at the name again, realizing that the woman he thought was just passing through carried the same blood that ran stubborn and steady through his own veins. And for the first time since she rode into Red Willow, he understood that she was not a traveler at all. She was a return. Caleb stepped back from the table like the floor had shifted beneath him, the old boards creaking in protest, his gaze drifting from the Bible to the woman standing across from him. No longer a stranger, no longer just a rider passing through Red Willow, but flesh and blood tied to his own story. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes before stepping into a gunfight or a confession. He told her his grandfather had been a hard man, the kind who believed survival was worth any sacrifice. Land disputes back then were settled with rifles and fire, not lawyers and paper, and if a child had been hidden away, it would have been to keep her from becoming a target, not to erase her. Yet even as he spoke, he wondered how many truths had been buried alongside pride. She listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on the cedar tree visible through the window, its branches swaying like it remembered. She said her grandmother had spoken little of the Turners, only that there had been danger and love tangled together, that a brother had sworn to come for her once the dust settled, but he never did. Years passed, the Ashford name became hers by necessity, and by the time peace returned to the valley, the path back had grown cold. Caleb felt a sting behind his ribs at that. Thinking of promises broken by distance and silence, he wondered if his grandfather had tried and failed, or if fear had hardened into stubbornness. Word travels fast in small towns, and by midday a pair of riders approached the Turner gate, Sheriff Doyle and old Mr. Whitaker from the general store. Drawn by curiosity in the sight of a stranger's horse tied outside Caleb's house, Caleb met them on the porch before they could knock, shoulders squared, jaw tight. The sheriff tipped his hat and asked plain what business was unfolding on Turner land. Caleb hesitated only a second before answering that it was family business, and that was enough to still further questions. But Whitaker's eyes drifted past him to where she stood in the doorway, studying the cedar tree like it held her childhood. When the men finally rode off, satisfied or simply unwilling to pry deeper, Caleb returned inside to find her standing near the fireplace again, the Bible closed but not latched. She asked him what he intended to do now that he knew, her voice steady but carrying a tremor beneath it. He considered the question longer than he expected. Part of him wanted to push the book back onto the mantel and pretend none of it had happened, to let Red Willow keep its simple version of the Turner story. Yet another part, the part that had felt alone since his father's passing, recognized something rare and fragile standing before him. Not a threat, not a claim, but a chance to mend what had been torn long before he was born. Caleb picked up the Bible once more, running his thumb along the worn edge of the page where Abigail Rose Turner's name rested. The ink faded but stubborn. He fetched a small inkwell and pen from the desk in the corner, tools his father had used to record cattle tallies and weather notes. He hesitated only a heartbeat before lowering the nib to paper. Beneath Abigail's name he wrote another line, in careful script: Eleanor Grace Ashford, granddaughter of Abigail Rose Turner, returned to Red Willow. The sound of the pen scratching against paper seemed louder than any gunshot, and when he finished, he looked up at her, not asking permission but offering recognition. Her breath caught as she stepped closer, eyes shining not with tears alone but with something steadier. Relief perhaps, or belonging. She touched the fresh ink gently, as if afraid it might smear and vanish. Caleb told her that whatever had happened generations ago, whatever fear had driven a family to hide its own blood, would not dictate the future of the Turner land. The cedar tree outside had grown through storms and drought alike, its roots deep and unyielding, and family ought to be the same. She gave a faint laugh at that, saying her grandmother had always loved cedar wood for its strength and scent, and for the first time since she arrived, her smile reached her eyes. They walked out beneath the wide western sky together, stopping at the base of the cedar tree where Caleb's father rested. The wind moved through the branches with a low, steady hum. She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth, whispering something too soft for him to hear, perhaps a greeting, perhaps a farewell. Caleb removed his hat and stood beside her, feeling the weight of years lift just slightly. Red Willow would talk. Towns always did, but let them. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows or half-remembered stories. It was written clear in leather and ink, and rooted deep in the soil beneath their boots as the sun dipped low once more, painting the horizon in gold and crimson. Caleb realized she had not asked for land or money or apology. She had only asked to see where her story began, and in doing so she had changed his own. He turned to her and said there was an empty room in the house that had not been used since his father passed. If she wished to stay longer than 2 nights, longer than 3, the offer was plain and honest. She studied the house, the fields stretching beyond, the cedar tree standing guard, and then she nodded, slow and certain. The stranger who rode into town at sundown was no longer passing through. Her name was written twice now, once by history and once by choice, and the Turner land, at last, remembered all of its own.